maybe what I'll do is I'll start by reading a couple of sections from my book, and that way you'll kind of know, because since it just came out, everyone's like, I haven't read it yet. I'm like, I know, you're forgiven. That way you'll kind of just get an idea of the tone of the book, and I feel like I don't even have a good elevator pitch for the book because it just encompasses so much. It is really based on, I call it my awakening, just because that's kind of the term that people are using now for waking up. It's really, I really equate it to kind of being asleep. In the first chapter, I talk about how I believe that we are all following a program that is instilled in us. It's not like a program in a bad way. It's just like a computer runs a program. And we're running a program just unconsciously in our life. And it's formed from our parents. It's formed from, if you grew up in the church, it forms who you are. But in the first chapter, I talk about the American dream and how, let me just pick something, and I'll just go with my first plan of just reading some sections. So I said, maybe we should tell immigrants coming into America that to live the American dream means they would actually be checking their freedom at the door. They would have better quality of life, living in their village, on their terms, and connected to purpose, not unconsciously running the American dream program that is on repeat here in the United States. I say that because I feel like, as you know, even as parents, we're saying, like, we let our kids watch the Disney movie, and that has a program that we don't consciously recognize. It's the someday your prince will come, and we have the American dream, like everyone is entitled to, you know, this pursuit of happiness as part of this idea that we are all raised with and ingrained in us. And then the next chapter is about false awakenings. And my idea of false awakenings is basically a midlife crisis, because what happens in an awakening is you have something in your life that occurs. It might be a cancer diagnosis, it might be a spouse that leaves you, it might be, like mine was actually very subtle. My awakening was just listening to a podcast and learning that we are made of energy. So it wasn't, but I call it a false awakening because it doesn't really connect. It doesn't sink to like a deeper level. And so my false awakening started when I was 35. And it was very much just like, you know, being at home with the kids and not feeling like there's more to life than this. And so I started working from home, and I talk about just working even harder and then ending up with anxiety. Like I use air quotes, but I was diagnosed with anxiety, and it's like, how does this happen? And then you have judgment on yourself because you have like diagnosed anxiety or depression. And so that was kind of like my midlife crisis. But then when we had the opportunity to move to Washington, D.C. for a year. And I'm always about like, let's go do that, like take every opportunity. And so we did that, and it allowed me to have kind of the space in my mind with not having all the things to do in my normal daily routine in my own home. We picked up, we moved, we lived in an apartment. It was like we were on vacation for a year. It was great. But I had this all-time low in my life and listened to this podcast, and it just kind of flipped a switch in me. And I was raised in a very traditional Christian home, and my husband and I had just continued that path and raised our kids in the church, and that was just what we did. And I had my awakening, and I started kind of going, if we are made of energy, then why did Jesus die for us? It just disconnected for me. And so I talk about, in the next chapter, I talk about how I started really just exploring, like, what thing, like, I just started learning more. I started reading more books. I hadn't read a book that was not a Christian book ever, I don't think. And so that was one of the realizations that I had, that was like, I feel like I was just in this just very narrow system, and I just decided to start reading some other books. And so I read like Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. I actually have a resource guide in the back that talks about, like, not talks about, but it lists all the books that I read in the order that I read them, because I kind of think maybe that's interesting to people. Like, okay, so she read like Essentialism, the 10X Rule, like I read a lot of business books, and then I went on to Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, which is a very interesting book. Like, it's very much about like your subconscious, unconscious programming. And so I was like, oh, I like this. And I just started getting interested in just more spiritual things and less religious things necessarily. And so I talk about, after that year in Washington, D.C., I moved home with the kids for 6 months, and my husband had to stay for 6 more. So it was like the universe or God just gave me the 6 months just to like process it by myself. And so I talk about that, and I do add a couple of dates in here so you can kind of see, like, July to December was like these 3 chapters, and this is sort of all the things that I covered in those 3 chapters. So I thought maybe that would be helpful. But I came home with the kids. My husband visited kind of like on the maybe one weekend every other month. It was very little at that point because he was trying to, and actually the whole story of our marriage is just he traveled a lot. He's been gone a lot. So we are both kind of on these different paths. So there's an underlying, possibly interesting theme to people in the book about like how, you know, how that is unfolding, and it's not resolved. It's a work in progress and a journey. But I talk about energy, and I get into just some fun things. Like I did a little podcast on the moon cycles, because if we're made of energy and the earth has an energetic pull and the moon is related, like my brain is very scientific. I think in the end, it's like I am very science related or science driven. I talk about the moon cycles and just fun things like sun gazing and sex energy, which is something Napoleon Hill talks about. So my aunt read the book and she was like, it's a really good introduction to a lot of things. I said, oh, thanks. And hopefully you can like go on your own journey from that, you know, take what's interesting to you. I think that's one thing that I'm preaching now is I just want my kids, I want people to be open to things. Take what works for you out of this, and that you don't have to be married to it like a religion. I talk about Reiki energy healing, which is Angie's specialty, because we had this conversation at the dinner table the other night. I won't say who it is in case we use this on my video, but someone that we know had an accident and she hurt her knee, and she's supposed to go to college and play sports in college, and I don't think that worked out. And she found out this fall that she wasn't going to be able to play sports in college. Like she didn't get accepted, or she didn't get any kind of scholarships like she was hoping for. And that she ended up not too long after getting injured. And I told my family, like, we're just having this conversation around the dinner table. I said, gosh, that's really too bad. I feel like people kind of can draw in experiences. Like, I know it's an accident, but all these negative kind of emotions that were leading up to her not getting a scholarship, all this pressure that her parents were putting on her to get a scholarship so they didn't have to pay for her college, and then she gets injured. It's like, you gotta kind of connect the dots, and I feel like that's connected to energy. Like, negative energy stuck in the body can cause disease. Like, there's a lot of work by Dr. Joe Dispenza that I talk about in here, and he studies spontaneous remissions for people that are able to change their thoughts and then in turn kind of like reprogram your body to believe those thoughts. You know, like the power of suggestion is very powerful. Blah. So, but none of my family was like, so you're saying it wasn't an accident? I'm like, no, I'm saying it was still an accident, but you know, it just ended. The conversation didn't go very well. But then I do start talking about a little bit more with parenting, and I feel like one of the things that as parents we feel like it's our job to, you know, raise our children and teach them what we believe. And my kids are all over the age of 11 now, and I kind of feel like this is the time when I want to come alongside them and help them to choose what they want to believe. Again, just being open to saying, like, this is what your dad, I mean, because, you know, my husband is still is strong in his faith, and I have left the church, and so I don't want my kids to necessarily follow my path, but I want them to choose for themselves. And one of my chapters, or one of the things I talk about that is, let's see, talking to my kids. We had an interesting, just talking to the kids about heaven and hell, and you know, I think for me it was hard it wasn't really hard for me to change my beliefs, but it was really hard at first for me to even figure out what I believed then. And so Rob Bell is a person that I feel like has a similar situation where he was raised in the church and he was a pastor and learned that Jesus was Jewish, and that was kind of his awakening to be like, wait a second, if Jesus is Jewish, then why why did this happen, and and so that kind of unraveled some of his where he was headed in life, and he changed that. And he has a book that's called Love Wins, and he's somewhat, I think by the time he wrote this book, he was a lot more confident in his new belief system. The title of the book is Love Wins, a book about heaven, hell, and the fate of every person who lived. So it's, very much just was a book that I used in talking to my kids, but I talk about going to counseling and just how my husband kind of felt like he's playing the antagonist role in my journey. And I said, it's okay. Like, every journey has all these pieces, and I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for you. And there's just a lot of appreciation, I think, in our relationship, or at least I appreciate where I am now. I don't know if he appreciates it as much, but I talk about just new conscious habits that I try to put in place to try and just stay in that place of consciousness and awareness and being intentional about things. And I just talk about my experimentation with that even, like trying vegetarianism and like, why did I do that? Did I do that?
I just did that and I was like, why did I do that? I couldn't do it. I'm done with that. No, I was gaining weight even more.
Right. Well, and my advice is ask your soul. Like, should you be eating meat?
I just
and
repented and said, I need meat.
Well, and Angie is a vegan, and I talked to her about that because sometimes, even with something, I talk about this in the book too, but just even with thoughts and associating with a paradigm of any kind, you just do it often and not, like, you don't ever check in and see, like, why am I doing this? Like, am I still doing this for the right reasons? Am I still, is it still working for me, really? I talk about, I really like my my sections on parenting, and I have one called Children Who Don't Need Our Approval, because I feel like we sometimes parent from our own lack, and we are raising kids, we have self-esteem issues as parents, and we're in turn raising our kids to have self-esteem issues. And so I'm like, wouldn't this be a concept if you could raise your children who didn't even need your approval as a parent? And that was kind of heart-wrenching for me to think about, but very freeing to think that would be amazing to accomplish that, I guess. So then I close with meeting Jess Lively, who is the woman who had the podcast that kind of triggered my awakening, and how spiral dynamics was something that I talk about in the beginning of the book, because I think it's a scientific, it's a developmental model for the evolution of consciousness and humanity. It's pretty far out there scientifically, and trying to get your head around it, but it's kind of this cyclone shape thing, and at the very tiny little base is a caveman, and his awareness is just very small and minimal. And then as it goes up and expands, it's enlightened, Jesus, Buddha, and so Christianity, and where I was halfway up in this tier that was good and evil, authoritative, and it was an interesting thing to get my head around, seeing my perspective, which was my entire life, as just a sliver of potential humanity. And not that we have to always aspire for enlightenment, but seeing where that was, and seeing where a caveman kind of consciousness is, and that we're just having one sliver of perspective of our consciousness. And so I feel I shifted immediately out of the level that I was in to a science-based kind of consciousness. I viewed everything from a scientific perspective, but I did not stay there for very long because it just wasn't me. And then the next level, I think, has to do with Earth and the planet, and you just want kind of the best for everyone. And I don't know, there's a couple different, but just the idea of spiral dynamics kind of came full circle at the very beginning of my awakening, and then again at the end in this conference that I went to with Jess Lively, because she talked about spiral dynamics and really unfolded all this perspective. And I thought, wow, I am just shifting my consciousness. And I feel as everyone shifts their consciousness, whether you call it waking up or what you call it, I feel the planet does have a chance to improve. You know, I think there's a lot of doomsday kind of like, you can really go down the spiral of like the oceans and the water supplies being contaminated and all of that kind of thing. But I still feel like there's hope. I feel like people are waking up with the internet. I think that has been a hugely like triggering thing where all this information is available like all the time, and so that was something that kind of happened at the end. And then the last chapter, I talk about just my four components that I feel can help you navigate your awakening, but it can also just help you in your daily life. And that is just that idea of awareness, or being conscious of things, being intentional about things. And then I was like, I should really know what I said. I always forget because I get nervous. And then making space. I feel like making space for me had a huge part of my awakening, but also every day meditating, just going through like a breathing sequence where you just slow down your thoughts. Like there's so much science now that backs it, going back to my like science moment, there's so much science that backs like being able to recreate circuits in your brain, you know, improve your memory, reduce stress. Like there's a lot of benefits to just sitting quietly and breathing for 15 minutes a day. And that allows for growth and expansion of your own, you know, well-being. And then I talk about healing, because I feel like that's what was missing in my own like awakening, my midlife crisis, to comparing the two. The difference was that I actually healed some of the patterns that I brought from my parents. And I talk about, and this might get too deep, and I don't know if anyone wants to bring it up later or ask a question about it, but I talk about the pain body. And that's also the same as like our unconscious shadow. It's like the negative behaviors or thoughts in your unconscious. And I share some stories about how when I was in my mom's stomach, when you don't really think that you're passing on, you know, any moms here, like you don't really think you're passing on any kind of energy necessarily or emotion to your baby. But I feel like I was born rejecting my mother's breast milk. I had terrible eczema, like they could not get under control. I still have scars on like the back of my neck from open wounds for months and months, and I had really bad asthma. So I had all these issues as a baby, and I really feel like they were this transferred negative emotion from when I was in my mom's stomach. And I didn't find this out until probably like 2 years ago. I asked my dad. I asked my mom. I don't think I asked her directly. I asked her about something else. But I asked my dad, like, what was going on around the time that I was born? And it was pretty traumatic. Bad stuff with their relationship. Like, they moved to, I was born in Montana, and they like packed up and moved out to Montana, and like all these things were like really, really like bad that were going on while my mom was pregnant with me, even up until the moment that she delivered and after I was born. And I'm like, okay. And even just knowing that, I feel like that's what Carl Jung is. I talk about him a lot. He's like the father of analytical psychology and depth psychology. He talks about just bringing the unconscious to the conscious. Just being aware of it can help you to like work through something and let it go. And I share a story in the book of when I was pregnant with my third child. We had a lot of stress going on around, like my husband was supposed to be deploying like the week that she was coming. And so it was like, is she gonna come? Is he gonna be able to see her? Like all that kind of stuff. And then we moved for 6 months, And I was in a very small apartment with 3 kids under the age of 4, and my husband was gone for 6 months. And it was like the worst 6 months of my life. Like, I was a terrible mother. It was a lot of screaming. Like, I just can't, I block it out whenever possible. But I think, oh, that's why she projectile vomited for the first year of her life. Like, I definitely could see that I passed these things on to her. And now, I don't know that I shared, I guess I tried to like share it gently in the book because she's still, you know, running around here taking pictures with me occasionally and stuff, but she had some like almost like panic attack type things when she was like 7, 8, 9, and I was like kind of didn't know what to do at the time. But after learning about this and learning about that pain body and how it can kind of continue, like we carry a lot in our bodies, and that's why crying and just easy things like that are good, or Reiki, like energy movement is good in our body. And so I was able to kind of start implementing some things with her, like awareness, just like being with her, like, okay, it's fine. We're just feeling bad right now. Like, let's just feel bad right now. It's fine, you know? And so just implementing different things with her, because it's one of those things like you think, oh, my child just has this temperament. Well, it can be changed. It's probably, if you are willing to do some of that work, some of that, you know, work that people don't always want to do, it can just at least be approached differently or handled differently. So I talk about that a lot, and I feel like a lot of what we are doing with parents is just so important. And I see this at all levels, like my son who's in high school, I see issues with, you know, some of the moms and things. I'll tell a mom something and she'll tell her daughter. I'm like, why would you tell your daughter that? That was between moms, you know? And I feel like things like that are because the mom doesn't have like that kind of, I don't want to keep saying self-esteem, but it's like, you're a mom. Like, that's not a child discussion. And so I feel like there's a lot to be worked on with parents. As I follow this Dr. Shafali, she's written the Conscious Parent and Awakened Family books. And she talks a lot about when people come into her office, it's because they have issues with their kids, but she just flips the mirror back on the parents and says, hello, like, you haven't worked through your own stuff. You're just passing this stuff on. Like, and your kid just is, you know, if you're a parent, like, it's hard to be a parent. Like, that has probably been the biggest, like, just transformation and learning in my life from my children. And so I'll stop talking for a minute, and I would love to just open up to questions, comments, experiences.